The police thought they were stopping just another old man. But 30 minutes later, when federal agents arrived, everything changed. This isn't just about who he was. It's about what he carried, and why no one saw it coming. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got something powerful coming tomorrow. The rain started not long after sundown. It came steady, quiet, tapping against storefront windows and glowing street signs. The town of Caldwell, already slow-moving, had gone still. A few cars drifted through puddles. The rest of the world had turned in for the night. At the edge of town, officers set up a routine DUI checkpoint. Nothing out of the ordinary. A few cones, some idle patrol cars, and soaked uniforms under dim streetlights. No one expected anything unusual. Frank Delaney, 79, lived a few miles out. Most folks barely noticed his house when they drove past. Just a sagging porch, a screen door that creaked, and a man who kept to himself. They called him Mr. Frank. Quiet, old school, always polite, rarely seen after dark. His truck was as old as the stories they told about him. A Dodge from the 60s with faded green paint, a side mirror held by tape, and an engine that rattled before it roared. He never drove at night, never left town. But that evening, as the sky turned ink blue, Frank pulled onto the road. In the passenger seat, a weathered steel case lay strapped shut. He kept glancing at it, his face unreadable, but his grip on the wheel said enough. When he spotted the checkpoint lights ahead, he eased off the gas. The rain kept falling. One officer waved him to a stop. He was young, maybe early 30s. His jacket darkened with rain, flashlight cutting through the drizzle. License and registration. Frank handed both over without a word. The officer noticed the case. "What's that?" Frank hesitated. "It isn't for you," he said quietly. "It's going to the bureau." That was enough to raise concern. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Frank obeyed. No protest. He opened the door, stepped into the rain, and stood still beside his truck. Another officer joined, then a third. They eyed the case, asked again. Was it dangerous? What was inside? Frank gave no answer. That silence was enough. The cuffs came out. He didn't resist. He just kept his eyes on that case, even as they read him his rights and searched the truck. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just made the worst mistake of the night. Rain slicked the highway, turning the town colder by the minute. Frank sat in the back of a patrol car, his soaked coat clinging to his shoulders. The door shut behind him with a dull thump. He leaned back against the seat, silent, unmoving. His face gave nothing away. The radio crackled. One of the officers called it in. Elder male, non-compliant about contents of a locked case. No weapons visible. Found veteran ID in the wallet. The dispatcher paused before asking, "Any threat?" The officer replied, "Negative, but something feels off." They didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't cooperating either. Not in the way they expected. He didn't fit the pattern. Inside the cruiser, Frank's gaze was fixed on the blurred windshield ahead, as if he was looking through time. The case, now out of reach, seemed to anchor his thoughts. Water pooled at his boots, leaving slow-drying marks on the floor mats. Still, he said nothing. At the station, he was led through a side entrance. A few heads turned as he passed. Officers at desks, a sergeant sipping cold coffee. But none lingered long. The arresting officer gave a quick rundown. An old man, strange case, veteran ID wouldn't explain. The sergeant gave him a once-over, eyebrows raised. "All right, we'll sort it." Frank was booked like anyone else. Fingerprints taken. Mugshots snapped. Forms signed. No argument. No questions. Just the same quiet patience. The kind that unsettles more than it calms. The case was labeled and stored away in evidence. Locked behind a wire mesh gate and tagged without urgency. One officer joked it probably held medals from Vietnam. Another guessed maybe a collection of stolen antiques. No one considered the truth. No one could. Frank was taken to holding. A gray room, colder than the rest of the station. One bench, a camera in the ceiling, cinderblock walls, the kind of place meant to make you uncomfortable fast. He sat down slow, hands folded, back straight. The door closed behind him, and the lock clicked louder than usual, like the room itself noticed who had just walked in. Out at the booking desk, the officer who entered Frank's information paused. Something strange had flashed on the screen, a quick alert, gone in seconds. It wasn't a warrant, not a match, just something different. He clicked back through the logs. Nothing. He flagged the sergeant. There was a flash. Something not normal. Try again. He did. This time the screen glitched. The interface went dark for a moment, then returned. Different now. A line of text appeared. Secure individual and item. Stand by for federal response. Do not proceed with questioning. The officer stared. The sergeant leaned in, reading the message slowly. Neither spoke. They had never seen a directive like that. Not from any database they used. Not at this level. A stillness settled over the room, the quiet hum of flickering fluorescent bulbs now louder than before. Inside holding, Frank hadn't moved. He sat upright, hands resting neatly on his knees, spine straight like time hadn't bent him. He wasn't watching the door. He wasn't waiting for anything. And yet somehow, it felt like he already knew what was coming. Something had shifted in the room, even if no one could name it. That system alert hadn't glitched. It came from somewhere real, somewhere higher. The language was too deliberate. Secure the individual. Do not question. Await federal response. This wasn't protocol. This was something else. Sergeant Mitchell, a man with 25 years behind the badge, had handled every kind of call a small-town station could throw at him. Break-ins, assaults, missing kids, but never this. He stood at the evidence log, eyes scanning the entry for the steel case. Marked, personal item, just a placeholder. For a second, he considered going back to look at it, but something told him to wait. Near the break room, Officer Torres lingered by the coffee pot, pretending not to watch. He'd been the one to cuff Frank. At the time, it felt routine, just a stubborn old man with a locked box. But now, with that alert still echoing in his head, nothing about it felt normal anymore. The phone at the front desk rang once, then again. The dispatcher answered quickly, her voice dipping low. After a moment, she crossed the room with purpose and handed the phone to Mitchell. He listened. No questions. Just a quiet, understood. Then he hung up. The room had stilled. Every officer had stopped moving. Eyes drifted toward him, waiting. Mitchell exhaled. Federal response is inbound, he said. They were alerted the second his ID was scanned. They'll be here in under 30. No one cracked a joke. No side comments. The silence now had weight. Someone went to check the holding room. Frank hadn't moved. Mitchell turned to the officer overseeing evidence. Move the case. Separate locker. Nobody touches it. Nobody opens it. The officer nodded, said nothing, and left the room. Inside the cell, Frank sat exactly as before, his frame still upright, hands resting neatly in his lap, his eyes slow to blink, his breathing steady. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't confused. He was waiting. Every few minutes, he'd close his eyes for a breath, then open them. No twitch of anxiety. No sign of discomfort. Just stillness. In the back hallway, a few younger officers had gathered. One searched his name, Frank Delaney. The results came up ordinary. A veteran, lived alone. No criminal record, no spouse, no children, no ties that explained why the federal system would flag him. Why him? One of them whispered. Torres made his way back to Mitchell. What now? Mitchell didn't even look up. We wait. No questions. No contact. The room grew quieter. Every sound felt sharper. The buzz of the lights, the ring of a phone, the shuffle of someone crossing the floor. All of it landed heavier. And still, outside, the rain kept falling. The rain had thinned to a light mist, drifting over the parking lot like breath on glass. Streetlights cast stretched-out shadows across the slick pavement, orange and long and ghostly. Someone finally asked if they should offer Frank water. The sergeant nodded. Go ahead, no questions. An officer moved quietly down the hall, opened the door with care. Frank looked up, offered a small nod, then returned his gaze to the floor. He didn't speak, didn't move toward the door. The bottle was placed gently on the ground just inside the room. The officer backed away, closed the door again, and returned to his seat without saying a word. At the front desk, the dispatcher was glued to the security feeds now, flipping through angles, scanning for movement. If federal agents were truly on the way, she wanted to see it first. And something told her, this wouldn't be a normal entrance. Back by the holding area, Sergeant Mitchell stood at the hallway window, watching rainwater streak down the building's edge. He had worn the badge long enough to know when things had stepped beyond local hands. And this? This was far beyond. Whatever was in that case. Whoever Frank truly was. It wasn't routine. He turned toward Torres. His voice was low, measured. Keep an eye on the entrance. Torres nodded, passing the bulletin board and stale coffee pot on his way to the front. He took his position near the glass, eyes fixed on the lot. The clock above reception ticked louder now, each second stretched like a wire pulled too tight. The earlier chatter had vanished. Officers who'd been cracking jokes now sat in silence or paced the floor. Even those who hadn't seen Frank firsthand felt it, the quiet shift of something bigger moving in. Inside the cell, Frank finally shifted. He leaned back slowly, resting against the wall. His expression didn't change. No fear, no irritation, just that same steady calm. Like he'd been here before, like he'd known this moment would come. Then, from outside, the low hum of tires on wet asphalt. Torres caught it first. His eyes narrowed. Headlights swept across the windows. Not cruisers, not local. These were dark SUVs, unmarked, identical, gliding in a tight line. Their engines were nearly silent. The dispatcher sat upright, watching the camera feed. 6 vehicles rolled into the lot. No lights, no sirens. Just motion. They stopped in front of the building in perfect formation. Then, without a word, every door opened at once, and out stepped men and women in black suits, moving as one. They moved without sound, earpieces in place, folders tight beneath arms, every motion precise. These weren't people new to chaos. They walked like they'd done this before, many times. Inside, Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, voice firm but calm. "Keep your heads. Be professional." Chairs straightened. Hands stilled. The loose energy from earlier had vanished. Now everyone was watching. The front door opened. First through was a woman in her early 40s. Dark jacket, sharp eyes, badge in one hand, authority in her walk. 2 agents followed. No chatter. No hesitation. She approached the desk. Agent Dana Clark, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her credentials were checked, then returned quickly. No questions asked. She asked for the man in holding, and for the case he had brought. Mitchell nodded and led her down the hallway. Every officer they passed stood quietly, the only sound the soft rhythm of dress shoes against tile. At the holding cell, Clark stopped. "I'd like to speak to him alone." Mitchell unlocked the door. Frank was already on his feet. He didn't wait to be asked, didn't need prompting. His expression was unchanged, still, calm, steady. Agent Clark studied him for a beat, then gave a small nod and stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. No one heard what was said. It didn't last long. When the door opened again, she turned to Mitchell. "He's not under arrest. He's to be released immediately and treated as a protected federal asset." Her tone left no room for debate. "No more questions. No further processing." Mitchell answered with a single nod. Frank was moved to a quiet room. Not the cell. A towel was brought for his shoulders. Coffee offered. This time, he accepted. Sat down. Still silent. He watched while the agents moved. Clark requested access to the evidence room. Mitchell walked her there himself. Together, they unlocked the separate storage locker. Clark approached the case like it was wired. She didn't touch it. Not directly. Gloves on, scanner out. When the latch clicked, she opened the lid slowly. Inside, old documents, worn files, sealed envelopes. A flash drive nestled in protective foam. A stack of faded photographs. And at the bottom, a small black rectangular device, edges worn. A serial number barely readable. Clark narrowed her eyes. She whispered something to the agent behind her. He was gone within seconds, phone to his ear. Mitchell hovered near the doorway. "What is it?" Clark took a moment before answering. "Something from a closed file. An operation that hasn't been publicly acknowledged in over 30 years. Most of the details are sealed." She glanced back at the device. "But he held on to this. All of it. For decades. And now whatever it was, had resurfaced." Down the hallway, no one spoke. They just listened. Most of them had never seen federal agents inside their station before, let alone a situation flip from routine arrest to full federal control in under an hour. Agent Clark returned to Frank and asked softly, "Are you ready?" He gave a single nod. Before leaving, she turned to Sergeant Mitchell. "May we use a conference room?" Just for a moment. He led them to the back. Inside, the case was placed gently on the table. Frank sat beside it, his hands resting neatly in his lap. A few officers lined the walls, unsure whether to sit or stand. They stayed quiet. Clark looked around the room. "Frank Delaney," she began, "once served in a Cold War-era task unit. Not standard military, not public record. It was a joint agency operation designed for intelligence gathering, threat monitoring, and safeguarding highly sensitive material." She glanced down at the case. "What's inside was part of an off-book mission called Project Emberwatch. It was intended for Senate review, but the operation collapsed after a final mission failed. Everything was classified, buried, forgotten. She paused. He was the only one left with physical proof. Clark turned to Frank briefly, then continued. The plan was simple. He would hold it, keep it out of sight, until a specific clearance level was reauthorized. That clearance came a few weeks ago. Quiet, unannounced. She folded her hands. But this wasn't just duty. It was personal. A promise made to a dying teammate decades ago. Frank vowed to protect it, and to deliver it only when the time was right. She let the words hang in the air. That time was tonight. The room fell still. No one moved. The weight of the moment pressed into every corner. Clark gave a small nod. Thank you all for your cooperation. He's done nothing wrong. In fact, he's done something most people never get the chance to do. Frank rose slowly. His gaze passed across the room, finally landing on the young officer who had cuffed him. The officer nodded once. Quiet, ashamed, grateful. No words were needed. Clark resealed the case and gave a silent signal. The agents prepared to move. Outside, the SUVs waited like shadows in formation. The drizzle hadn't stopped, but it had softened. The pavement shimmered beneath the lights. Frank stepped into the hallway with quiet resolve. One agent walked beside him, not as a guard, but with quiet respect. The same officers who had doubted him now stood aside. Their eyes followed him, unreadable. At the entrance, Clark turned to Mitchell. Thank you for your professionalism. She paused. There'll be a follow-up briefing. The Bureau would follow up in the coming days. That's all Agent Clark said before they left. Sergeant Mitchell nodded. We'll be ready. At the doorway, Frank paused. He glanced back once, at the quiet station, the men and women who had watched him come in as a mystery, and now stood still in something close to reverence. Even the radios had gone silent. Then he stepped into the night. Mist touched his shoulders, clung to the rim of his cap, but he didn't flinch. His steps were slow, steady. One of the agents opened the door of the lead SUV. Before climbing in, Frank turned once more, his eyes sweeping the station behind him. Still, no words. The convoy rolled out just as it had come, in silence, headlights sliding across wet pavement, engines barely louder than the rain. Inside, no one returned to their desks. Phones rang unanswered. Papers sat untouched. It took several long minutes before the rhythm returned. But even then, something about the place felt changed. Later that night, Mitchell sat at his desk, pen in hand, staring at a blank report. There was no template for what had happened. It was already federal. Still, he wanted something in the file. Not a statement of facts, just acknowledgement. He wrote that Frank Delaney had been released. No charges, no incident. That he had cooperated. That he had left with federal protection. That was all. In the days that followed, the town whispered. Some had seen the black vehicles. A few claimed Frank had been government once. Others said it was all a mistake, but no one really knew. And the ones who did? They said nothing. A small article ran in the local paper. Federal agents, unexplained visit. No details. It vanished by week's end. Frank's house stayed quiet. Until one morning, just after sunrise, neighbors saw that old Dodge again. Slow. Familiar. He parked at the corner grocery store, stepped out like always, picked up the same few items. Bread, coffee, canned beans. At the counter, he paid with exact change. The cashier, young and wide-eyed, looked at him differently now. Frank gave a simple nod, then left. At home, groceries went on the table. He poured coffee, took it out to the porch. The sky was clearing. The road stretched ahead, peaceful. He sat in his chair, hands wrapped around the mug. Watched the morning settle. The mission was done. The weight was gone. No medals, no fanfare. But that was never the point. He had kept a promise. And now, he could rest. That Sunday, a black government car pulled into his driveway. A woman stepped out, plain clothes, wooden box in hand. Frank answered the door. No ceremony, no speech. She passed it to him with both hands. Inside, a folded flag, a letter with an agency seal, and a photograph, faded, creased. A young man in uniform, Frank's oldest friend. The note read, "Your delivery made the truth possible. His name won't be forgotten. Neither will yours." Frank stood for a long moment, holding the box, then nodded, and closed the door. The weeks that followed were quiet. His routine returned. Same truck, same wave to neighbors. But people saw him differently now. Not with suspicion, but respect. the kind reserved for someone who carried more than anyone ever knew. Frank never spoke of that night. He didn't have to. The ones who mattered already understood. The others, it wasn't their story to carry. He kept the wooden box on a shelf above the fireplace. Never pointed it out. Never mentioned it. But now and then, he'd glance up, then back to the fire, sitting just a little taller in his chair. The night he walked into that station hadn't been about pride or recognition. It was about a promise, made long ago, far away, and now it was fulfilled. The world went on, like it always does. But in a quiet house on the edge of town, a man had finally found peace, and that was enough.